Well, hey, what's going on, everyone? I'm Greg Jones with Engine Builder. Welcome to a new episode of Intellectual Horsepower. Today, our guest is a legend of engine building, a legend of this industry, really doesn't need much introduction. Our guest today is Jon Kaase of Kaase Racing Engines. And joining us as always is Dan Schechner on the co-hosting duties. So, John, welcome to the show. How you been?
Oh, I'm good. Busy as usual. Yeah.
Well, glad to hear it. Glad to hear it. So, John, Dan and I have both been to your shop now.
Okay.
Fortunate to have visited you in person and seen the operation, which is really quite impressive. And like I said, many people in this industry know you quite well and know your work quite well. But for those that are out there that might not know exactly, what engine building you get into, maybe fill the folks in a little bit about, what your current focus has been.
Well, it's pretty well progressed, especially in the last few years. We do some different things that we didn't do before. There was a time when we did only drag race engines and really a lot of big engines, for the big inch pro stock stuff. So, yeah, and we still do quite a bit of that, but kind of branched out. And by accident, about maybe 8 or 9 years ago, we got into working on some of the offshore boat engines, and that really has taken over to be maybe 40 or 50% of our business anymore. But the offshores were a lot of Mercury Marine stuff that are it's a big Mercury Marine twin turbo. They call it a QC4, and it's sort of a unique engine that is totally built by Mercury, and it doesn't really share anything with any other passenger car engines. So, it's a really complicated, busy engine, but they're anywhere from 1100 to 1750 horse each, and there's two in every boat. They're a lot of work. They're really complicated, but we got to where we were working on them for the Geico team that raced in offshore boats, and then we got familiar with them then. And a lot of the stuff we do today on those engines are, um, they're really, I'm not going to call them pleasure boats. They're boats that they run on poker runs and all that, but they're 160 mile an hour boats. Okay, big
Yeah.
catamarans are 50 feet long, 45 feet long, stuff like that. But so that's taken over about half of our business. So that keeps us busy. And on those engines, there's not very many people that work on them. Um, Mercury doesn't like other people working on them too much. They won't sell too many parts for them. So we have some of those parts made, but it's been good for us. We kind of filled in when the drag racing and stuff slowed down, like especially during COVID. So, but a lot of the big Mercuries, we a few years ago, I mean, really, I'd say a few. It seems like a few, but it's more like 8 or 10 years ago. We bought
Yeah.
some equipment so we could machine our own cylinder heads, and so we've got our own patterns. And on some of the Ford wedge stuff, there's a cylinder head we built for the 460 style Ford. We call them a P51 or SR71 head, and then there's some Hemi heads that are similar to the original Boss 429 stuff. And so we on the Boss 429s, we've got really like an improved cylinder head that came on those cars in 69, 70. And we do a lot of those engines that are complete engines with all new parts. And they're, very rare to the drag race them. Most of them are street engines, but they're almost never less than 700 or 800 horse. They're usually 700 to 1,000 horse, but they're streetable engines. We do quite a few of those. They're complete engines, and but they're all Boss 429 head, and so they have that unique look with the valve cover and stuff that like what came in a 69 Boss 429 Mustang. So we do a lot of those. Then we machine and sell a lot of the big wedge heads that are like for the 460. So we've got crate engines, cylinder heads, Boss 429 complete engines, Boss 429 parts, the offshore Mercury style engines, and then we still are pretty heavy into the big inch drag race pro stock engines. And there's been a lot of times we thought that was just about ready to die off, the big inch stuff. And
Yeah.
just about the time you think we're losing people quit racing or they timed out and they get older and they don't want to race. And all of a sudden it comes back. And now this year is an exception because there's some other sanctions that came on board to run those cars. But if you wanted to this year, there's 24 races to go to with a big inch car. Usually there's 8
Wow.
at the most, and one of them will rain out. So usually you race about 7 times, but there's not enough cars to run that many races. Nobody can run that many. So we've got a lot of places to race those cars, and all of a sudden that's busy again. So and we sell some parts and stuff too. Just we ship a lot of parts out. So we've got
Yeah.
4 or 5 different places that we have income.
Yeah. Well, it definitely sounds like you're keeping busy, and it sounds like you're probably there most of the week, fulfilling all that. So
Well, yeah, most of the time we're 5 or 6 days a week. A lot of times, we try not to work late if we don't have to.
yeah.
I've been through that for years and years and years. And, I'm almost at the point where I can't work as much. But we've been building the pro stock type engines. At least myself, this is my 50th year we've been working on.
Wow.
So, I started in my early 20s. So,
Yeah.
and there's always more you could do. There's always things you could do if you stayed late, but you just can't do it every day.
You
Oh,
talk
no,
about
no.
the expansion and just all the different, types of projects that you've been working on. How do you balance such a wide variety of projects? I mean, that's a pretty, that's a pretty impressive roster of stuff you got going on there.
Well, there's some of them I don't really get that involved after, like the Mercuries, I worked on quite a bit when we first started working on them, but my guys that work on them here are really, really good at it. And then I've got a couple of people here, that do a lot of the business stuff. Cliff Moore's been here for 33 years, I think, and he pretty much runs the place. So I don't really end up having to coordinate all the parts to get here on time and all talking on the phone. I'm almost at times I'm just like an entry level worker, which is really what I like to do. Um, Ordering parts, not so much, maybe engineering some way to make something better or get it to work right, fixing problems. And I do a lot of fixing problems, but sometimes if the machine works sort of specialized, that's like we were talking about. I was making input shaft today for something for our dynos. So we can hook up a different kind of Mercury that doesn't particularly fit our stuff. So we have to graft some parts together for that. Those are things I'm good at. Maybe a vision of the future and what kind of parts or what we're going to be doing. Maybe that's not me. You know. But we have a kind of a diverse group of people here. We've got some young, some older than me, and everybody kind of gels together. Our team is really good.
John, you're talking a lot about the Mercury Marine engine stuff. Can you elaborate kind of how that whole partnership came about? Because you mentioned you're one of the few shops that can even do the work, because Mercury is allowing you guys to.
Yeah, well, this was in I think 2016. A lot of these things happen by accident. So, the one guy I mentioned, Cliff Moore, he went to the race at Key West with Keith Wilson, Wilson Manifolds, and he was helping the Geico team, Gary Stray and that group that with the Geico boat, and it was a pretty famous boat. It was like world champ a few times, and I mean, so we were, but they were just quizzing Cliff on how do you do this or what do you guys do? They didn't even know who we were, and after a few days, then they had all kinds of trouble, and so could you do some blocks for us? Maybe do some block work because they were having trouble getting it done in South Florida. Yeah, so yeah, okay, so we started doing some blocks and some repairs, and then really it ended up being probably. Within the first 3 or 4 months, I said, look, come down here with a trailer, get all this stuff, take it home and make it work, So we went from almost like a consultant to looking at it to honing on a few blocks to repairing a few things to managing their whole engine program within 3 or 4 months.
Wow.
And it took us about a year to really get all the bugs out of them, but they were punishing the engines pretty hard, and they're pretty good engines, but there's always a bad spot in everything, and we had to work on the spots that were trouble, and it took us a while, but we got them to where they really did good, and those guys were racing those boats at 160 and 70 miles an hour, and so we crashed a few, and they're it's a dangerous boat, and there weren't that many in the class at the time. And those are guys from all over the world would come and race with us. But a few years ago, Mercury or the people with the rules and even Mercury, they kind of got into it where they decided they were going to do a crate motor right from Mercury, and you couldn't touch them. And they dropped the speeds about 40 miles an hour because honestly, there weren't that many guys that wanted to race at 160 and 70 on an oval on the water, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not always that fast because when it's rough, you're in and out of throttle all the time. But they're dangerous boats, and they're probably terrifying. But now they've slowed them down some, and but it's a engine that really works. It's sealed, and we're kind of locked out of that. So we don't do anything for the Mercury, those big engines for the races now. But the byproduct of working on all those is there's a lot of those engines out there that are just, guys that are doing poker runs. And I don't really understand all that, but they get out there and they still go 160, 70 miles an hour. And they're basically racing against their buddies and stuff. And most of them are pretty well financed. They're a pretty good group of guys but the motors don't last. Sometimes they'll go 100 hours, but we're used to doing engines that go in cars, and most cars, drag race cars, don't matter what they are, you can't be wide open throttle for very long.
Sure.
You'll either crash or the drag strip, you're not going to be wide open for 4 seconds or 5 seconds or 6 seconds or something like that. On the street, you can't be wide open for very long because you either get up too fast or you'll wreck. So all of a sudden we're racing on these boats, and those guys will go wide open throttle until they run out of gas. So of course, what comes with that is they have to stay together and be reliable. And sometimes you work on the reliable part more than the speed, because with the turbochargers, really the speed's about whatever you want it to be. But they have to live and stay together, and so we're pretty good at looking into those things and trying to figure out where we can make them more reliable and make them better.
Yeah. Yeah. So John, if you could, you mentioned, when you first kind of got into this deal that you found some of the bugs or the little kinks where you guys could make improvements. What are some of those aspects? And then you mentioned the comparison to drag racing or a street engine. So, what are some of those biggest differences with the marine engine that's just running wide open and more to that
Well,
endurance
well,
aspect?
most of them, they've got them sort of limited where they won't go over about 6,500 RPM. But if you run them any harder than that, things start to show up. So we had to work on the valve trains and have some stuff made that was like valves, retainers, all the stuff you do on a drag race engine when you first started out.
Yeah.
A little bit lighter parts, but we built an engine to go to what they call a spintron, where we could watch the valve action and the timing chains and all that. We wanted to see what all that stuff did at 8,000 RPM, even though we might never get there. But when the prop comes out of the water, if you don't have it right, it might get there,
Mhm.
and so it has to live through that. So, we looked at all the stuff with the cam lobes and the geometry and all that. And it was pretty well done. It was mostly take what they had and make the parts a little stronger and a little better. And and some of the stuff we were working on, it had problems where it had blown up and stuff. So sometimes we were fixing areas of an engine that was previously damaged or something, like the cam bearings in the head or something like that. So some of it we were trying to stop the bleeding more than make it better. But the Mercury stuff, it's a masterpiece of an engine. It's really good. And the way they have them limited, they do really well. the RPM range they run them at. But if you try and run them more, you have to look into some of the valve train and some of the parts like pistons and rods and things like that. But we got a real lesson on it for a while. But pretty much you just have to build it like about any other race motor, and pay attention to some of the parts that are important.
Yeah, I was going to ask that about, looking at the marine platform versus, doing for drag and land engines.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a crossover? I mean, are there things that you can take from one application and apply or learn or that helps in your development for another?
Pretty much a lot of that stuff's the same. You need really good, of course, I know one of those you'll use steel rods, not aluminum, but you need really good connecting rods and a well-made piston and everything else is about like it would be on a high-end drag race motor. It just runs longer. Or an oval track, so it's got steel rods and the exhaust valves we use in those are Inconel. They're a form of steel. For that length of time, I don't believe we could run titanium. It'd probably burn up or do something bad. We can run titanium intake valves though, and but the good part of those engines is really they're twin turbo, and with the management of the turbos and the fuel systems and stuff, you can really make about any power you want. It's not like with our drag race stuff, you're working on it really hard and you're chiseling away for 5 or 10 horse on a 19 or 100 or 2,000 horse motor. You're still dying to get 10 more, on the boosted stuff, which we don't work on too much of, but on the turbocharged stuff, as long as the turbos are big enough, you can really make about whatever power you want to. It's just the way you manage it. So, you're not spending as much time trying to make it go faster, because you can make it go faster just by changing the computer or something. Okay, but you spend your time making sure that that the oil system works right, and the oil gets out of the motor. It doesn't stay in. They're dry sump engines, but they still have some issues where you have to make sure you don't run out of oil or something, and all the oil staying up in the heads or the pan or something. And there's a lot of different areas to look at to make sure that they don't fail.
Yeah, absolutely. John, similar to the question Dan just asked, where, if different engine platforms, kind of open your eyes to situations with other engine types or other applications. And I was curious about your time with the Engine Masters Challenge and, how much of your engine building experience to that point, helped you in that competition, or how much of the competition itself translated back into your other engine building?
I think it kind of goes back and forth, but that Engine Masters where you were running the engines over a really long, like from 3,000 to 7,000 or 2,500 RPM to 7,000 or whatever, it's such a long curve.
Yeah.
That I think that I learned quite a bit on that. I learned mostly what didn't much matter, and what did matter. And since they averaged all that power, you could that contest was won or lost by the time you were halfway up the RPM range, because you could if you had a bunch of bad spots where it didn't have any power, it didn't matter if it had all kinds of peak power, you weren't going to win anything because it was an average. So
Yeah.
and up until, of course, this going back 20 years, but up until that time, I'd never dynoed anything ever. It was probably started out below 5,000 RPM, and all of a sudden we're choking one down where I was afraid for a while, but I finally pretty quickly figured out it doesn't make any power down there, so it's not going to hurt itself no matter what you do. If it's a 700 horse motor, and it might only make 300, 3,000 or something. It's not making enough power to hurt itself. But
Yeah.
all that stuff matters. You find out what matters and what doesn't, and it's kind of odd, but on those engines, and really it's the same as for a street engine. It's a shock really, because the cylinder heads almost didn't make much difference the whole first half of the of the test, and that would be like all your RPM range you're driving around the street. The cylinder heads, it's odd. You could make the heads way better, and it wouldn't change anything. It's like the cubic inches make a big difference, and the headers make a big difference, and the camshaft makes a huge difference on the lower RPM ranges, and then when you get up about halfway, maybe almost every engine about 4,500 or 5,000 hits that magic spot, and then all that stuff starts helping. The more camshaft, the more compression, you know, better cylinder heads, manifolds, manifold length headers, all this stuff starts to show up. But on the lower RPM ranges, you learn pretty quick that what's not, it just doesn't change a bit. Like valve sizes and porting and airflow and all that. It doesn't mean anything at 3,000. But it means something at 3,000 is camshaft and headers and maybe intake manifold. But camshaft makes a huge difference down in the lower part, because if it's too big, it lets all the power out. So the problem was finding the right in between where it had any power in the lower, it still had some power up high.
Right.
That's where that one year we had that 4-valve engine. That's where that thing really shone. Was a 4-valve engine doesn't need much camshafts because it got so much valve area, So it could still make power up high because it didn't need a lot of camshaft, but down low it made real good power because it didn't have a lot of camshaft. So it was a huge learning thing for us, and a little bit of it might have crossed over to real race engines, but I think a lot of times you learn something on one engine and it might help another one. It might not. One thing you learn about all of them is doesn't matter what they are. If there's a few spots aren't right, it's going to blow up. You know, you don't. You can't have you can't have valves beating out the pistons, but crashing stuff, and you need clearance 4 or 5 places, and if it's not enough, it'll seize up and blow up, and it doesn't matter what it is. So you learn all those things pretty quick.
Yeah, you got to have a couple of those principles
Mhm.
correct no matter what. Absolutely.
Yeah, and there's other things that just doesn't really. It's not that it doesn't matter, but you can work on a long time and you don't see a lot of gains. So,
Mhm.
at this point, we work on the stuff we know will either help or help the longevity or help the power. And there's some things that doesn't seem like it matters much, and they really get overlooked anymore. You know, some of it.
Yeah.
Hey, Jon, you've said in the past, and I'm just going to take us in a little bit of a sidetrack here, but you said that you enjoy spending more of your time doing machining, dyno work, R&D, than actually running the business. And I think I heard you even say that the farther back in the shop you are, the better.
Yeah,
I'm curious. I'm curious when you realized that was your preference and how you managed to build such a successful business, focusing so much of your attention on back of the shop work.
well, I think it's been quite a while since I did a lot of engines talking as far as business stuff on the phone. Gradually I think my one guy Cliff Moore pretty much took over that, and then I've got another one, Doug Schriefer, up there. He does a lot of talking. Roger talks on the phone to people, and Roger's good about explaining different parts that go with different parts and things like that. And so I don't really have to do that. There's been a few times I answered the phone just because I might have been almost the only one here, and then I got a good dose of what those guys go through, because some of those calls are a little rough, but most of our guys are pretty good to call here, But I've always enjoyed working. I don't like working under a deadline, which unfortunately everything we work on has a deadline. But I'm not so much where there's more work to be done than time to do it. That can make life tough. But I like working on a little stuff and seeing some gains and power, things like that. And and I like going to the races when our guys do well and win races and stuff. But that's pretty cool.
How many races do you make it out to these days?
I don't know. It really slowed down during COVID, when there weren't that many. But maybe six or eight times a year. But sometimes we'll go to the boat race. I haven't been to a boat race in a little while, but we've been to Key West several years, and I will say one thing that the drag races are over fast, and even if you have trouble, it's not as painful. When you go to the big boat races and they're important, and there's 40 or 50 people there with that company, and they're on the crew and all that, and that boat's out there and it's running for 45 minutes, like at Key West, there's 3 races. It's brutal on your brain,
Yeah.
If it's 45-minute race, it seems like 4 hours. It just goes on forever. And if they're running lousy, it seems like it it's terrible. And if they're running up front, it's almost terrible because you're hoping the thing's over. At
Right.
the end of it, it's like fourth quarter of a football game, where your team's winning, but it could go wrong, and you
Just
just
end
hope,
already.
oh,
Yeah.
just get over with. It's rough. But I was never used to that. I'd never, I had done some oval track stuff, but the boat racing is the most nerve-wracking of anything I've ever been to. It's like it's unacceptable to have failure, where some of the other venues we're at, yeah, we're used to it. That stuff blows up once in a while. That's part of it. But the boats, and there's a lot of other things that fail on them too. I mean, there's water and hoses and drive shafts and transmissions, and there's quite a few things that can go wrong in a boat. Plus, they're like two cars because there's two engines and two sets of drive lines, and there's so many parts, and it doesn't take but one little failure, and it won't go fast enough, or it quits, or whatever,
Absolutely.
or sinks. It's rough.
Yeah. Well, that's racing in general. It doesn't matter if it's
Yeah,
on the
yeah,
water or on the track
right.
or
But at the drag races, though, it's over so fast that even if there's trouble, it's not as agonizing as watching somebody have trouble for 45 minutes.
right. Right.
Yeah.
So, John, you just mentioned some of the things that you enjoy doing in the shop. Do you have a favorite thing to be doing? Because again, when we made our visit, and you
Yeah.
mentioned at the top of the show some of the cylinder head work that you get into. It seems like some of that cylinder head development and cylinder head work is certainly a strong suit of yours. But did you have something that's a favorite?
There's a lot of stuff that you're working on, and you say, man, I'll be glad when this is over. I hate doing this. It's
Yeah.
like we had one the last couple of weeks, one of our guys at Charlotte, big inch car, broke a crankshaft, and it wiped out a bunch of stuff in the back of the block, and you have to, we had to fix all that, put main caps on the block and weld the housing boards up and reboard all and get it back in the right spot. Some sleeves and a lot of repair, and that's not bad if it's in the wintertime, but when they've got more races coming up and they only got a week or two, 3 weeks to get it done, that's pretty tough. And I would say if I had my choice, I'd never do that. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's not that much fun. Um, every little piece of putting a motor together, most of it, you're almost glad when it's over. It's not like you're looking forward to, you know, uh, getting connecting rods ready to put in or fitting rings or, putting a short block together. Well, you're looking forward to it being done and getting it running. You really, of all the things, you're looking forward to seeing it on the racetrack and perform good. And if you want to break that down, probably of my whole business, the whole highlight of this business for me is when we're at the races and somebody wins a race and you're there, and it's not so much the driver, it's all those people that are on the starting line, you know, and they're
Yeah.
all like there's 15 seconds of joy that you can't, it's unexplainable, everybody's jumping up and down. Nothing else in the world matters for about that 15 seconds, and there's a lot of people working on them, and that's their reward for working on them is when they get a win, so I enjoy seeing all the different cars that we work on. Um, they'll all win some, you know. In other words, everybody that we do work on they'll if they haven't won a race, they will, and when they win a race and you see all the people and their family and stuff, and they see them all excited for that few seconds after the win light comes on. That's a big deal for me, and I'm part of
Yeah,
it too,
absolutely.
but I'm jumping up and down with them, Really everything you do here in the building and putting it all together and dynoing it and everything that you do is going for that win light. Like I said, doesn't last for long,
Yeah.
but that's what kind of keeps you motivated and you work on everything within the limits of how much funding you have on every engine because sometimes you can put new parts in, sometimes you can't because we know, you know, who can afford it and can't. So you have to work within their budget,
Mhm.
but you work with it as hard as you can to hope that they go out and have a good chance to win,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, like you said, it's there's a lot of people involved, a lot of time involved, and
Yeah.
uh, yeah, all that excitement comes out when you see that win light. So yeah,
Yep.
absolutely.
And it doesn't, and for those, a lot of the stuff, it doesn't last real long because all of a sudden there might be a couple cars still to run, so you got to clear out. So you're only on the start line for a few minutes, a
Right.
minute or two. But as far as enjoyment, I get enjoyment out of seeing our stuff run well or whatever, win races. And
Yeah.
when you put it on the dyno and it does everything it's supposed to do and it makes really good power, that's a pretty good victory there.
John, again, I mentioned cylinder heads a second ago, and you're certainly well known for your cylinder head development on a couple of the platforms we had talked about. And when I was at the shop not too long ago, you guys had quite a few that the CNC machine was churning out, but they're kind of off the shelf as soon as they're on the shelf. With customers eager to get their hands on them. But I wanted to ask you a couple questions related to the development side of cylinder heads. What are some of those theories or strategies that you employ in developing a cylinder head and improving upon, a design that has been around for a long time?
Well, it seems like every year or two, sometimes your views change on what's right, you
Hmm.
know. But and most people are different, but here we don't really get real excited about a lot of airflow work. It's um, you'll find that you'll probably find that some of the pro stock 500-inch guys in a little bit of the same way. It's like, when's the last time you used that flow bench and saw a gain on a flow bench that made more power? Well, you ask them, I can't remember. Not very often. So
Yeah.
after a while, you say, well, what makes a difference? And it's all sizes and shapes. And you, you kind of in a port, I think you kind of hate to have dead spots where there's not a lot happening, like the air doesn't really go in there where you think it goes, or it skips over a spot, and you got a big spot where nothing's going on. May as well be filled in if you do. But
Mhm.
but I'm really not that good with the airflow part. We work on what we want the valve seats to look like, or underneath the valve seats, and the area down in the intake port, the area across what they call the short turn, which is like the window in there. If you look down the port, you see that kind of square in there.
Yeah.
Um, and you can change that size on some things, and it shows up pretty good. And then after you make a few changes, then it kind of goes back to where you can't make any more gains. But most of the time, when we on our big engine heads, when we make some changes in them, most of the time it does. That's not better, you know. So we all there's an awful lot of times we end up going back to what we used to have. We and I think your 500-inch teams, a lot of them are pretty close to that because they all run the same, and you don't see anybody making real big gains anymore. It's like when you on a big engine, you won't have this kind of power per inch, but 500-inch, you get to 3 horsepower per inch or something. That's a pretty good number. It's hard to make, but so much, you know, and
Yeah.
and you could, you might get the heads to flow better, but the engine can't take that much air in. It's just like And if they're bigger and it flows, if it flows the same and they're bigger, that means it's slower, and you have to think about things like that. Sometimes faster is better. But
Right.
and we're finding more and more the exhaust side of the head is it needs to be big enough and not too small in a bunch of places, but you can make it a lot better and it won't make any more power. And you know, and you can do some things that screw up the flow, but it made it a little bit bigger. Sometimes that's better. But we don't work on I used to work on it a lot. Then we finally found out, and sometimes you find out because other engines come in here that we didn't build, and the exhaust wasn't near as good as ours, and they still make good power, you know.
Mhm.
So you find out some of that stuff just doesn't. It's not that it's not important, but once you get to that one point where it's, certain size and all that, it's just anything you do, it just you can't make it any better, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And we changed camshafts around quite a bit. Um, it's not very often you see a gain though. You know, you can you can change the camshaft and make it bigger in some places where it'll make a gain up real high RPM at the end, like on a big engine,
Yep.
and it definitely won't run better in the car. It makes it harder to manage. So there's a big compromise goes on with camshafts. You got to have it where it has power everywhere, not just one place.
Hmm.
So and you finally come down to that spot, and once you get there, there's I'm not saying there's any more gains to be had, but for us, the gains are really small.
You get to a
Sometimes
certain,
there's some reliability goes with it too. Like we don't want to have a guy with a cam that's so fast that they put valve springs on it every run. It tears all the parts up, and they might not run any better anyway. But so we kind of look at um, we want stuff smooth in a way. Some of the older camshaft stuff seems like it runs pretty good. It'll run 30 runs and not tear anything up, and you're better off to have that than you are to have one that it's only faster for one run and then it kills all the valve springs. And the guys are there with not too many crew members and they're trying to change valve springs and stuff. Nah, we can't send stuff like that out.
yeah, absolutely. And John, does it differ with what you guys will do when you're discussing something like the Hemi head versus the Boss 429 versus the P51? Or are those theories still generally similar?
Pretty much similar. The Boss 429 had it's unique because the way it looks and stuff, but the other wedges that we do, they're really caught up to it power wise. They all make about the same power. If the valves are the same and they're ported the same, they make about the same power. But some of those wedges, like they'll make 1,200 horse on a 600-inch motor, and it's a
Mhm.
passenger car looking ahead. It doesn't have a high exhaust port and odd headers. It's an actual cylinder head and engine that'll fit in a car. So I mean, I don't know what more we want. I mean,
Yeah, right.
they're actually pretty high achievers for what they look like.
Yeah. All right. Very good.
But the Boss stuff, you really don't necessarily build those because they make more power. They'll make a lot of power. We have one guy that runs, 4 seconds on an eighth mile on a drag car. It's 1,200 horse motor, single four barrel. Most of the Boss 9 stuff ends up in street cars and show cars.
Mm.
And the wedges, they end up like the SR71 we call it, and the P51. Those end up a lot of them are in drag cars, but some of them are on the street. But they're probably on the racetrack. The wedge motors. They're probably 30 of those for every Boss 429 there is.
Hey, John. So, you've mentioned some of the platforms that you've worked on, and Engine Builder actually published an article about 12 years ago where you discussed your top 5 engines, and you talked about the P38 and the Boss 9 and your own Ford A 460 racing block, in addition to a couple of other ones. if you had to pick some of your top engines today, would it be the same list, or are we looking at some different ones that you really like?
Well, the only thing I'd add to it would be that Mercury Marine that we work on,
Yes. Yeah.
but really as far as looks go, and really when I was in high school, the Boss 429 Mustang came out. And the only reason they built those was so they could run that engine in NASCAR. So there was like 800 one year and 500 the next or something. That was about when I graduated high school. I wanted one of those ever since. They've actually risen in price probably more than my wages. So I'm probably farther away from having one now than I was when I was 16 or 17. But
Yeah.
but we build the parts for them, and the look of that engine and the mystique is what makes it really cool. And there's just not that many of them driving around. But the valve, and the big thing was the valve cover had an odd look to it. And in the Mustang when it originally came out, it was, I mean, it really filled up the engine compartment. Plus they had, at the time they had to have some smog stuff on them and smog pumps, and they had to have all this stuff to make them street legal. And I mean, when you open the hood of a 69 or 70 Mustang Boss 429, that thing doesn't have room for anything more. I mean, it's completely full of engines, looks huge, really cool looking. I mean, they had the battery in the trunk.
Oh, wow.
I don't think it was for weight. I think it's because there wasn't no room. That's what really helped sell those engines is the look. And there are probably a lot of guys my age that wanted one since they were, you know, 17.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the nostalgia factor at this point, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, John, you mentioned a couple times in our discussion, the various employees who make your shop run, really well. You mentioned Cliff, you mentioned Doug, and
Mm-hmm.
obviously we met a bunch of other folks when we were there. Um, so I was curious, how you go about orchestrating, you know, your shop employees and getting guys who have 30, 40 years of experience, but also getting guys who are in their 20s, maybe early
Yeah.
30s, who are, relatively new to the industry, but show an interest.
Well, it's getting harder and harder to
Yeah.
find people. It really is. But we're actually looking for somebody now, but we're trying, but not extremely hard. But several of our people here came from School of Automotive Machinists,
Okay.
Houston.
Yep.
Really good school. I like the people there. People that run it are fantastic. You know, Judson Massengill and his wife run it. They do a great job. And you can tell because the kids that come here from that school, they've had some really good training. And
Mm.
so, I've had maybe 5 of our guys from there. I think right now I've got 3. Three of our guys are from the school, and then there was a couple more that have been here, and then they went elsewhere, chose a different profession or whatever.
Mm.
But it's one place that that's good that you can go to, and when we have a need for somebody, we'll call them first. But it's hard. It's difficult to find younger people there. When I was a teenager, I was interested in cars, and what we did on a weekend was you went to the drag race. That was what you did.
Yeah.
There was whether you raced or you went to watch. There was where I grew up in Ohio. There was 3 drag race tracks within 40 miles of where I lived, and it wasn't anything to go to one and then go to another one on Saturday night and go to one on Sunday, and that was kind of like what people did. Well, it's not like that today.
Yeah.
It seems like when a lot of the drag races we go to, the only crowd there is the people we bring with us. There's a lot more things to do, and you know, when I was younger, there wasn't that many things. You go to a football game or a baseball game or drag races or the movies. That was about it. We didn't have computers. We didn't have internet. We didn't have any of that stuff. And you had to occupy your time. Now there's so many distractions, and kids, are like this always, and to find somebody that's really interested in cars and wants to work, there's just a smaller percentage, so it's getting tougher.
Sure. But, I got to imagine, you mentioned the School of Automotive Machinists being a nice resource, and I agree. And, we've made a visit down
Mhm.
there. They got a great facility, uh,
Mhm.
great program there. Um, but within your own shop, you mentioned the diversity of the engines that you're building and the applications that you're building for. Can you talk to, that being an aspect of engagement for the folks in the shop? Like I assume they don't get too bored. They're always working on something different and
Yeah,
learning.
they switch around a lot. I mean,
Yeah.
there's times when, we'll work on something small and then they're working on one of the big boat motors and then we get the big drag race engines, but we try and make it where, the guys that are doing machine work and assembling stuff, they're not, they're not so specialized that if they're gone or something, somebody else can't, you know,
Sure.
in other words, everybody is capable of assembling engines. Everybody can put one on the dyno and run it. There might be some stuff like maybe getting the valve job right or something like that. Some of the valve, like the Rattler head machine we have or something. Not everybody runs it, but other than that, maybe everybody can do everything. And so we kind of try and do that just really in case somebody's not here, you can fill in, and it keeps you from getting bored. I think you don't want your whole job here is you're born and honing blocks all day long.
Hmm.
No, the guys won't last. I don't think.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and it's nice to, if you put something together yourself and you dyno it and everything turns out, it's I don't know if you might not get that many attaboys, but at least yourself, I did that,
Yeah.
it's nice that any of the guys out there can look at it and feel good about it. It's like one of my guys, Trevor, he's been assembling some of the big inch motors for the drag race stuff, and we were down at Bradenton. I don't know, there's 5 or 6, 7 cars we had there at this first. There was a World Series of Pro Mod, but they had Pro Stock too, big inch. And I said, Trevor, you assembled everything that's here. Yeah, you're right. It's like, well, I said, you should feel good about that,
Yeah.
and it keeps you going. Makes you feel bad when you see one tear up, but that's part of it, right?
Hey, John, sorry, I just wanted to ask, and I mean, this is something that we've discussed, internally for a long, long time. But you've always been so open about sharing what some would consider secrets, call it information, or really just sharing your knowledge. Is there anything that you won't share? Is there anything that you consider, maybe, something that you'd rather keep close to the vest, or are you pretty much an open book? I think that's kind of been your reputation.
I don't think there's not really too many things we really would talk about if somebody asked. And I think probably, I don't know how many years ago, all of a sudden you'll wake up one day and you realize that, the people you'd rather didn't know some of that already know it. You know what I mean? It's like, who are you keeping a secret from here? The guys that are your toughest competitors already know this stuff. They're as good as we are, and they've already figured it out. And if and as far as if you want to be in this business, the more the better. It's like, if you want to work 7 days a week, and, make average money, and you know, okay, there's plenty of room for you. The problem we have though is with these businesses is the cost of the equipment has gotten to the point that if you wanted to start a place, you'd have to buy an existing shop and have some kind of terms with the owner or something. You couldn't go out and buy everything you need to do the work that we do anymore because the equipment's too expensive.
Yeah.
And even if you bought used stuff, and you'd have to have the work to keep it busy. And then also, you know, if you have all this equipment, you can't run everything at once, so you need more people. And you know, it's
Yeah.
something that takes a really long time to get orchestrated. And with us, we're almost done buying stuff, not making real big purchases, but we've been buying stuff for 30 years. You know, engine machines and
Yeah.
parts and CNC machines and dynos and hones and you just it seems like it never ends, but you can't buy them all at once because you can't afford it. It does
Absolutely.
worry me in the future, as far as race stuff. uh, you know, you don't see too many people starting new shops with all new equipment unless they had a rich uncle or something. And those shops I've never seen survive. You know,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
so
good point for
it's
sure.
we're kind of like radial engine shops or something. There's just not that many. As the guys retire, there's not that many of them that start up. I don't think.
Yeah,
And
like you said,
you know,
there's room for more folks, and the industry can use more folks. So it's nice to see shops like yours that do have the younger guys in there, learning from someone like yourself and learning all these different
yeah,
engine types and engine platforms and applications. So more power to you. And John, on that note, I'll open it up to you if there's anything else that we didn't quite touch on that you want to talk a little bit about to an audience of your peers and just
yeah.
racers and enthusiasts. And if not,
Well,
we're just curious about the future of the shop and what's next for Jon
well,
Kaase and all that.
I think that right now we're just going along and doing what we're doing. We really don't have uh, a need to do any more than we're doing because we're pretty much maxed out. You
Hmm.
know, um, but as far as this business goes, the biggest thing I can tell people is you really need to figure out what's important and what isn't. And there's important parts of the engine, and there's parts that don't matter too much. But the big thing is you have to get stuff done.
Yeah.
And so you've only got so much time to work on something, and you could take twice as much time. And everything you work on really is never actually done. It's important that things get finished and go out the door.
Yeah.
And there's things that can stop you from doing that, and you have like the parts didn't come in. And a lot of times with us, it's like some of the reason we have the machines we have is because we depended on other people, and other people wouldn't always get stuff done. And if one thing doesn't get done, then the whole engine doesn't get done. So by this time, most people that are still in business, they've learned to do everything themselves if they can. In other words, when a cylinder head casting comes in from the foundry, when it leaves here, it's in a box all washed up and ready to put on the motor with valves and stuff. We don't have to have somebody else help us with it. And as far as in this business, you need to you need you need to learn how to repair things, and you need to know how to weld, and how to weld things like aluminum blocks, and do repairs. You don't want to send anything out. You need to
Yeah.
be able to machine a sleeve and get it in there same day instead of waiting for somebody to make it that's not in a different state. You need to you need to be able to really be well versed in just manual lathe and Bridgeport stuff where you can make stuff to finish the job you're working on, and you don't have to wait for anybody. But, all those things are really important because if it doesn't get finished, you don't get paid, and then all of a sudden you're out of money. So
Absolutely.
pretty soon you learn what's important, what's not important, and you really want to spend your time wisely because you only have so much.
Well, John, that's really well said. And I think it's a good way to cap our discussion for today. I don't want to speak for Dan, but I think the two of us could talk to you about engines for quite a while. And we'd be happy to hear your knowledge on the subject. But again, really do appreciate the time. And Dan, thanks as always for co-hosting. And guys, we appreciate all you watching this episode of Intellectual Horsepower. Make sure you are checking out everything that Jon has going on there at Kaase Racing Engines. And as always, make sure you're checking out enginebuildermag.com for more great engine content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.